Thank you so much for joining us today, Home Secretary, fresh from that wave-making speech at the Tory party conference. I've got to say that watching that speech, I felt Hillary Clinton could never sort of get away with doing that speech. Her handlers would stop her making that speech because it was so direct and so assertive. Did you expect the sort of the blistering headlines afterwards? Were you ready for it?
Well, no, this was something that I'd been saying, actually, for some time now. And I think it was important to reiterate the issues around high levels of immigration, because if you go and talk to members of the public, this is a real concern for people. And I think they need to see that actually the politicians, that government recognises the issue and is willing to do something about it. And I think it was important. Obviously, I went on in the speech to talk about the issue of abuse of asylum, our asylum system, and how we can be more generous to those people, the refugees who are in genuine need of our protection. But I thought it was important to say what government should be doing in these areas, because it does matter to people.
Yes, it does. I mean, but you also, obviously, you went out of your way to say, we are going to take care of the people who are the refugees of real human, atrocities and abuses in Syria and in the camps. But obviously tougher on the people who are economic migrants and who, have a choice in life. But the trouble is that there's so many agonizing borderline cases, aren't there? I mean, this is the agony with asylum. There are so many borderline cases that it must be very difficult, in a sense, to not find yourself in the end put in a position where you're deporting people in real need.
Well, of course, we've got the proper systems in place so that people's, when somebody does claim asylum, their case is looked into very carefully. There are opportunities to appeal for the courts to make decisions in cases across the immigration system. But there are some things within the system that I think it's important to deal with. For example, I think most people would be very surprised to hear that in the last 5 years, over 500 people from inside the European Union, from other countries in the European Union, have claimed asylum here in the UK. Now, all but a handful of those cases are ones which have been rejected because they were not proper asylum cases. So it is right that we take action in those sort of circumstances.
Yeah. Do you sometimes feel yourself, though, conflicted between a desire, to reach out in the human sense to having to hold the line on an immigration policy?
Well, I think what's important in matters like this, and indeed the Prime Minister referred to it in a sense when he was talking about the Syrian refugees and our response and increasing the number of Syrian refugees we're resettling here in the UK, is that this is an area where you have to have both heart and head. Because, of course, you're conscious of some of the terrible traumas that people are going through. And in the case where people are fleeing from bombs and fleeing in fear of their life. But on the other hand, you have to make sure that what you do in response is practical and deals with the issues.
Now, obviously, that speech that you made was very carefully thought out, and it was very, very strong. And I had a sudden flashback as you were talking of that famous time when Mrs. Thatcher said in response to call for greater central control of Europe, no, no, no. When you said, not in 1,000 years, I thought, do you ever hear Mrs. Thatcher's voice in your head? I mean, when you were a young worker in the Tory party, you in your 20s, you were just coming up, about to sort of launching into your political career. She was Prime Minister. I mean, is she ever in your head?
Well, I'm not somebody... Margaret Thatcher was a unique politician who did an amazing job in turning this country round when she was Prime Minister. But I'm not somebody who sort of hears other people in my head in that sense, if I can put it like that. I just sort of go out there and do what I believe to be right and say what I believe it's important to say at the time.
Was she influential at all, though, on you? Because she was the only woman who'd been Prime Minister, and there you were as a young woman trying to make your political career.
Well, I'm not somebody who sort of has a role model that I aspire to, or somebody who I think I want to be like them. And I just always get on and do what I think is the right thing to do.
That you're forging your own path. Let's just talk about another one of your challenges, which of course is the Goddard inquiry into this historical sex abuse. Do you think that we see Leon Britton has been terribly hounded, and he's died now, and his widow, it's tragic for her to have her husband so smeared by these pedophilia allegations, which now turn out not to be true. Do you think that Tom Watson should be made to apologise for what he's done to that family, the MP Tom Watson? And do you think, how does this not now become this witch hunt of people who really can't defend themselves sometimes in the historical abuse questions?
Well, I think all those of us in public life need to be very careful about the language we use and how we talk about things. But if I could just step back in a sense and say, why is it that we've been looking at this issue? And I think it's just been brought home to us in a very personal, very human way. We have just heard the story of somebody who, as a child in school, was being abused, but nobody listened. As we've just heard, there were other people who thought something might be wrong, but did nothing about it, didn't challenge at all. And sadly, there are too many people who have similar stories, that they have been through abuse in different institutional settings or in different sorts of settings. They tried to say something, they tried to look for help so that it would stop, but too often they've been ignored. And that's why I think it is absolutely right that we have the Goddard inquiry, which is looking into the lessons we need to learn, particularly about how institutions which, in very many cases, like in a school, had a duty of care to children and yet failed in that duty of care. We need to look into that. And of course, if there are specific allegations, the police need to look at those. They need to follow them up properly, look at them very quickly and carefully. And of course, if they're not going to act against somebody, then let them know as soon as is possible and practical to do so.
Which they didn't do in Leon Britton's case, which was sad. Okay, so, I mean, I know that you have actually demonstrated a great deal of compassion and outreach as Home Secretary. I don't know whether people know how many survivors of sexual abuse you've sat down with, how many victims of death in police custody. You've actually made a point of meeting people and hearing stories like we heard from Helena. Which of these encounters that you've had, because I know you've had a lot, made the deepest impression on you?
Oh, gosh. It's difficult to say because they all make an impression and a different impression because they're all about people who have been through a situation where something has happened to them or a member of their family and has happened at the hands of institutions, of parts of the state that they should be able to trust. And I think, in a sense, that's what's at the heart of all of these issues, is where people feel that organisations like, obviously, the police, if one's looking at issues around deaths in police custody, or teachers, or people in care homes, or in the churches, when one's looking at issues around child sexual abuse, people were in settings which they believed were ones that they could trust, and that trust has been shattered.
Yeah, and when you're in these sessions with these survivors, what are you learning? Why do you want to hear from them personally?
Well, it's very important to hear from people personally because I want to try to better understand the impact that this has had. And I think one of the key issues that has come to me, and it came across just now with Helena as well, when I sat and listened to victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, is that this is not something that goes away. And when we look at historic cases, some people say, well, look, this is in the past. Surely it's historic, it's in the past. Actually, we shouldn't really call them historic cases because they are cases where people are living with this every single day of their life. It doesn't stop when the abuse stops. The memory is there, the impact is there, and that is something that they carry through for the rest of their life. And it's interesting, I tend to use the term victims and survivors because some people will prefer to be referred to as survivors, some as victims, some will make the point that there are victims who didn't survive. You know, there will be people who maybe have committed suicide as a result of what has happened to them.
Which of the police reforms then that you've implemented, because a lot of this has been about, at times, the police just haven't taken these cases seriously enough. So which of the reforms that you've implemented do you feel have been the most effective? And what still frustrates you? Because you've been quite tough on the police. I mean, you really are, as we saw in that video, you laid it down with them. It has to change. So changing that culture of the police is a huge task. So which have been the things that you've done that you think have had some effect?
Well, there's a lot that I've done in terms of police reform, and there is still more to do. I think in relation to issues like the child sexual abuse, and it runs into issues like dealing with domestic violence as well, of course, improving the professionalism of the police through the College of Policing, I hope will have a really significant impact. But one of the other things I've tried to do is to give the police more of an opportunity to be able to exercise judgment, so that they're not just ticking boxes against a set of targets. They're actually using some common sense and judgment when they're dealing with people in whatever those particular circumstances are. But we still need to reform. There is still work to do in terms of the culture, but also in terms of the flexibility of the police workforce. because the skills they need these days in dealing with crime aren't necessarily the same as the ones that they've needed in the past.
Are they going to overlearn this lesson now? I mean, it's very difficult because on the one hand, police are trained to be skeptical. When somebody's telling their story, they want to punch holes in it in order to really see whether it's true. So, of course, that's the exact opposite kind of atmosphere you need for a victim of sex abuse, because there they have been afraid of telling their story, and then if they do tell their story and they're then picked to death about it, they're not going to want to come forward and they're going to feel humiliated. It goes right back again to where it was. So how do you change that without at the same time having the police launching into these endless witch hunts with people who don't have anything real to say?
Well, I think the first point is just to say, listen and understand what somebody's saying to you, and don't dismiss it out of hand straight off. Do actually look into it and investigate it properly. But of course, one of the things the police have done is, there are people being trained specifically in these areas so that they are better able to understand how they should approach somebody who is a victim, because you're absolutely right, there will be victims and people who are coming forward with allegations who at various stages find it very difficult then to talk about what has happened to them, be they a child or actually sometimes an adult who's suffered from abuse, perhaps from domestic violence, or somebody who's been trafficked. Somebody who has been trafficked and is perhaps effectively in slavery. Very often it's difficult for them as well to be taken out of that environment and talk about what's actually happened to them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people obviously see you as a very sort of tough and formidable woman, but a lot of what you're dealing with is actually rather grim and painful. I mean, it's public policy intersecting with personal tragedy, really. Is that how you expected the Office of the Home Secretary to be? Are you finding yourself more involved with these issues of personal pain and all of the things that you're dealing with seem to intersect with those issues?
Well, the Home Office obviously covers a number of areas of activity, but fundamental to it is about keeping people safe, keeping people secure, and the work that the Home Office does actually impacts on everybody every day. It has a real impact on people. I suppose in my time as Home Secretary, I have been dealing with a particular number of issues that have, if you like, raised some of these more personal circumstances for people, be it the child sexual abuse, domestic violence, which I've also looked at, particularly trafficking and modern slavery, and some of the other issues we've dealt with, like how the police interact with people with mental health problems. So we have been addressing a particular number of those areas, but it is all part of what the Home Office does, which is about keeping people safe and secure and ensuring, obviously, that in looking at the different issues, we are dealing with people fairly and justly.
Do you feel, though, that you are bringing, prioritizing these things yourself? I mean, inevitably, any minister has issues that are particularly important to them. Are these the issues that speak most to you?
Well, I think these are really important issues. And one of the reasons I think they're really important is that people have been silent about them for too long, haven't looked at these issues in the past in the way that they should have done. And I think that's why I think it's important to bring them to the fore now and to make people aware. I've said publicly before, I think in terms of child sexual abuse, people would be astonished at the extent to which this has been taking place. Sadly, we have still seen, with the Alexis J report a while back of the child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, we still see this going on in this country today. There are people who are being trafficked not just across the border into the UK, but within the UK and placed effectively in slavery today. It's happening in other countries too. But these are issues we need to be aware of, and we need to be willing to confront them, raise awareness of them, and deal with them.
What do you think is going on that there has been such endemic abuse in this country? I mean, I was interested when you said, this will go right through society, and you implied that at the end of these inquiries, we're going to have a very different view of our own society. What's your assessment of what has been happening in this society, that this has happened in this way, that there's been so much abuse of children?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, part of the point of the Goddard inquiry is to try to get behind what's been happening. I think it's very difficult. I think what I find particularly shocking is this fact that, as I was saying, children were in situations, in institutions, be it a care home or a school, or as I said earlier, in churches, as we know, been cases in churches too, where they believed they could trust people, and there were people there they couldn't trust. But then they couldn't trust the system. The system itself failed for them because it failed to listen to them and it failed to do something about the accusations.
And you feel that's a mission of yours to fix that?
We need to fix that, and I guess that's part of the reason why we have seen there has been so much, because almost it's been allowed to happen because institutions and others who could have brought a stop to it or could have done something have turned a blind eye to it, or have thought perhaps, oh well, it can't possibly be that individual doing something like that.
Well, you're a vicar's daughter, and I can't help but thinking, do you feel this is a moral crusade of your own?
Well, I hesitate to be somebody who talks about moral crusades. That isn't just what sort of comes into my head, but it's something where I saw this. I felt we need to do something about this.
Yeah.
There is an injustice here, and we need to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, most politicians sort of seek approval. I mean, it's just sort of part of the job in a sense. But that doesn't seem to bother you. I mean, I think what people do find impressive about you, and actually quite, in many ways, scary, and sometimes people feel, is that you really are seem to be without a desire to seek approval, and it's people try to strive to get that. Is this a learned skill, or something that you've always had that you actually just don't have? You're not that bothered by what people say or about you.
Well,
perhaps you are bothered. Perhaps you're terribly bothered.
No, I mean, I think it's always easy to say something in order to be liked, or that you think is going to be liked. It's harder to say or do something that may not be liked, but do it because you think it's right. And I suppose I always just look at everything and try to do what I believe to be the right thing to do, whatever the circumstances and whatever the issue.
How much is your husband a human shield? I mean, you obviously have a wonderful partnership with him. And he's very much involved, in a sense, he's obviously a great political mind as well. He's very interested in your career. Tell me how your partnership works and how your personal and political life have interweaved.
Well, we met at a Oxford University Conservative Association disco. We were introduced by the late Ben...
That sounds very racy. Hope that doesn't get out.
And we were actually introduced by the late Benazir Bhutto.
Gosh.
I suppose an interest in politics has been there for both of us for some time. He is hugely supportive, and that is, it's very good to have somebody there who sort of understands, is interested in politics and understands the stresses and strains of the political world, but who's actually doing something different, and therefore can bring, we can talk about the stresses and strains of his world as well, and you bring a different perspective.
The other day, after saying that she hoped there would be another female leader of a main Westminster political party, Nicky Morgan was asked if she'd ever throw her hat into the ring. And she said it would depend on her family. She said she has a 7-year-old son and whether it could withstand the pressure. And I was saddened to see, I think it was today, that Mrs. Thatcher, in the new book about her, said she felt that she'd failed as a mother, but even though she'd been successful as a politician. And you don't have children yourself. I mean, as you look around your colleagues, do you think that that the pressure of having children and trying to intertwine that with politics does keep women out of politics?
No, I mean, sadly that hasn't, obviously children haven't happened for us, but I don't think, I mean, this is one of the issues across not just politics, but business life and journalism and media and so forth, is about women balancing between the work and the life and family. I don't think that's what puts women off going into politics. I think there are a couple of things. One is, I think often women will look at what is the most seen part of politics, which looks like pretty rough and tumble, and think, well, maybe I can achieve in other ways. And I think also often women just need somebody to say to them, I think you could do it. I think men, by and large, are more sort of think of this as a career for themselves and sort of go out there to do it. I think women very often might think about it, but often just need somebody tapping them on the shoulder and saying, have you thought about going into politics? Have you thought about being a local councillor? Have you thought about becoming an MP?
Well, I know you've done quite a bit of work in actually sort of helping to mentor women into thinking about a political career. Tell me a little bit about that. How do you go about that?
Yes, well, I co-founded, first of all, when I was party chairman, we looked at some of the processes within the Conservative Party of selection for women to see if we needed to change them, and we made some changes in the processes to ensure that there was a genuine level playing field. And then I co-founded in 2005 with Baroness Anne Jenkins and some others. We came together and co-founded an organisation called Women to Win, which encourages women to get involved in politics in the Conservative Party, to stand for election, and also then mentors them. Because often women don't have the networks that men perhaps more naturally have from their experiences.
Did you find that an impediment to you, that you didn't have that network? I mean, how did you get the courage to stand and become the leader that you have? Who was pushing you and mentoring you?
Well, I think, and this is going to sound terribly repetitive because of something I said, but I didn't really have somebody who was a mentor in that sense.
Right.
But it was something that I'd wanted to do for a long time, and I was a local councillor before I became a member of Parliament, and I sort of went through that, and I tried never to think as I was going through the processes that at any stage, if I failed to get a selection, for example, I didn't say to myself, oh, it's because I'm a woman. I tried to say, what questions didn't I answer very well?
Right.
What area of knowledge do I need to beef up? And things like that.
Yeah, well, you didn't give yourself a pass at any point in terms of rigour. I know, could see that. Obviously, women sometimes feel that clothes is a real part of their self-confidence, and you have. Do clothes, are they an important thing in defining a power woman? I mean, the blue zigzag dress, I mean, that was a fashion statement and a half. I mean, it was really a great sort of power dress. It must have taken some thought. Going through your wardrobe, why did you choose it?
I wasn't sort of thinking of it as a power dress. I thought I'd wear a dress. And
that was a very, very good dress.
And it had to be sober, and it was. I mean, I'm a woman, I like clothes.
Yeah.
I like shoes, I like clothes.
Good for you.
And
you too as well.
And I think it's one of the challenges, I think, for women in politics, in business, in all areas of working life, is actually to be ourselves.
Yeah.
And to say, you know what, you can be clever and like clothes. You can have a career and like clothes. These are not separate.
Love it. So what do you love about politics? I mean, you obviously do love politics. You've given your whole life to politics. Why do you love it so much?
It may sound terribly trite, but it's because you really can make a difference to people's lives. Obviously, as a minister, you can do that through the sort of legislation you're passing, through the actions you take, like setting up the Goddard inquiry, which I hope will make a difference to people's lives. But you also do it as a member of Parliament on a very individual basis in your constituency. When people come to you with problems, you can't always solve everybody's problems, but actually when you can help somebody, and when they come back and say, actually, I came to you and I had this issue and now it's been resolved and things have got better as a result, that's a really good feeling because you have actually made a difference to that person's life. Well,
you're now the longest serving Home Secretary, which is kind of remarkable. What do you want your legacy to be? I mean, you've taken on a lot of tough things in the last 5 years.
Yes, and I suppose, I mean, it is about making a difference, but if I go back to what I said earlier, the Home Office is somewhere which affects people's lives in a very, very real sense. And I hope that I've restored to the Home Office that it is a great Department of State. And people in the Home Office work incredibly hard. They recognise the importance of what they do. And that we go on, it's a department that carries on making that difference to people's lives on a daily basis and recognising that we need to ensure that people are being treated fairly and justly.
Thank you so much, Theresa May, for joining us today.
Thank you.